Welcome to another session of Family, getting to like the people you love. We're covering all sorts of relationships in this series. And of course, one of the important relationships is our relationship with God. And in our greeting, the traditional greeting on the anniversary of our marriage with God, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, we discussed the nature of our relationship and the reason and the purpose for God making himself unseeable and what that does to bring out the depth and the intensity of that relationship and how that applies to human marriage, to husband and wife. This talk was at a series of lectures at the Chabad House in Minnetonka, Minnesota, and the talk went like this. I want to ask a very simple, basic, fundamental, and important question. Why can't we see God? Here's the problem, and this is the reason I'm asking the question. Generally, we tell children, when children say, "Where is God? I don't see him." What do we say to children? We say, "Well, you can't see God, he's a spirit." That's not a good thing to say. And theologically, that's not correct at all. Because what that does, it actually makes God sound less real than we are. See, we're real. We're tangible. We have substance. God is some kind of a barely existent whiff of something. But that's not good. It's not true. Let's start from the beginning. In the beginning, there was nothing but God. So what's real and what's not? God existed before anything else, which means God is more substantial. His existence is more real than ours. And yet we dismiss him as a spirit. He is not a spirit. The truth is that God is, rationally, logically, more visible than physical things. Why then can't we see him? So the other answer is because we're not holy enough. Because we have very limited vision. Because our eyes are defective. Our vision is defective. If we had better eyes, then we would see him. But there's a statement in the prophet, in the Navi, where it says that in the future, in the days of Mashiach, God will be revealed and all eyes will behold him. Now, if the problem is that our eyes are defective, then God revealing himself isn't going to help. So in the future, if we're to see God, there would have to be some kind of a eye transplant or something. We would have to have new eyes. But the fact God will reveal himself and we will see, how is that? Yeah.
Why it's important to see him? It's not important.
Why is it not important?
You have the faith, it's not important if you see him or not.
That's true. Maybe it's important not to see him, but we'll get to that in a minute. But now we're talking about purpose and benefit to seeing or not seeing. But let's talk about the ability to see or not to see. So to say that we can't see God because our eyes are defective is also not a good and true description. Because to say that God cannot be seen by physical eyes is not only a fault or a flaw in our eyes, it's also a limitation on God. The whole point of God coming down to Mount Sinai, well, maybe not the whole point, but a big part of it was that the belief that God was in heaven and earth was godless, that belief had to go. Because it's not true. If God is in heaven and not on earth, then he's not God. Then he's an angel. Angels can't handle earth. They do well in heaven. But that's because they're angels. They're finite creatures. But God is truly infinite, and therefore he can't be limited to heaven or to holy places, and he can't be excluded from unholy places, because then God has a limit. So the fact that our eyes are defective should not be a problem for him. He can handle defective. He's infinite. So what we come out with is this. It depends on what we're talking about. Which part of God are we talking about? Because there are statements all over the Torah that say, because your eyes are corrupt, that's why you cannot see. Remove the uncircumcised heart from you, and then you will... So yeah, there are some problems we have to fix, and then we'll be able to see. But then on the other hand, why shouldn't we be able to see it without fixing? It depends on what we're talking about. God is holy, right? It says in the Torah, be holy because I am holy. God is holy. Holiness is not God, because holiness is finite. God is infinite. So in God's infinity, he is holy. In his infinity, he can be unholy too. God created the holy and he created the unholy. But God is holy, he identifies with the holy, but holy is finite. And therefore, holy can exist only in a place of holiness. It cannot coexist with unholiness. And that's why if our eyes are unholy, we're not going to see holiness. That makes sense. To see holiness, you got to be holy. God is divine, whatever that means. But divinity is finite. And therefore, in order to see the divine, you have to be divine. Like you were saying, we're not God, so we can't see him. But what can't we see? We can't see the divinity. We can't see the holiness. God is infinite. Well, we can't see infinity because we are finite. And infinity has its limits because infinity is not finite. So all of these adjectives, any of these descriptions that we have of God's qualities, of God's attributes, of God's talents, all of those things, in order for us to see them, we would have to be equally talented, equally holy, equally divine, equally infinite, and so on. If we're not infinite, we don't see infinite. We're not holy, we don't see holy. We're not divine, we don't see divine. But when we're talking about God himself, God himself should be more visible than anything else in the world. Because he is everywhere and he is everything. So any explanation or any statement that says we don't see God because he's over there and we're over here, that's not God. Why then don't we see him? Moshe saw God's back, he couldn't see his front because you can't see God without dying. In other words, God is visible, but do you want to die? So that's not saying God is not visible. On the contrary, that's saying God should be visible, but then you got to die.
Can the angels see him?
The angels see holiness, they don't see him. Here's the difference between human beings and angels. Angels will never see him. Angels see only holiness. And that's why God can't communicate with angels. Because they can't get past the holiness. Human beings, gifted with the inability to see holiness, don't get stuck on the holiness and want to see God. So Moshe, having seen God's holiness, having spoken to God face to face, whatever that means, having heard his voice over and over again, says to God, let me really know you. Well, what do you want? Only a human being can do that. An angel wouldn't know that there is more to see once they've seen holiness or infinity or whatever it is, depending on the type of angel. But every angel has its quality, and that's the quality it sees in God and can't get past that. Whereas human beings can see all of God's traits and then say, okay, now what are you really? Who are you? And that's why when they ask, what is your name? God says, my name is whatever. When I'm doing kindness, I got this name. When I'm doing punishing people, it's a different name. My name changes with my activities. You want to know me? Oh, you didn't ask that. You just wanted to know my name. So I got my name? That's not good enough. Moshe knew God's name and then said, yeah, but who are you really? That's called intimacy. Okay, let's get to the topic. Oh, 1 second. So why don't we see God? Why can't we see God? Because He chose not to allow us. It's a voluntary thing. It's a choice. It's God's will that we not see Him, not His nature. If we can use the word nature in reference to God. By God's nature, He is eminently visible. More visible than anything else. But He chose, voluntarily, He wishes not to be seen. And therefore, throughout history, wherever He wished to be seen, He was seen. Nothing had to change. God didn't have to recreate our eyes or change Himself. Whenever He wants to, He is visible. And that's why in the time to come, in the Messianic time, God wants to be seen, so He will reveal Himself, meaning He will allow us to see Him, and we will see Him. And it won't be a miracle, because it's a matter of choice on God's part. Let's go into it a little bit deeper. And this is all, it's preparation for the topic. It's not. Human beings have free choice. I have free choice. I can choose to be seen or not be seen. If I don't want to be seen, I know a place I can hide. And if I want to be seen, I know places where there are people. So if I want to be seen, I go where people are. When I don't want to be seen, I go where nobody goes. But that's the limit of my freedom of choice. Imagine a person alone. Remember that ad, I have fallen and I can't get up? Imagine a person is alone, away from people, but desperately wants someone to see them. Wanting is not going to help. Nobody can see you. And the person says, but I want someone to see me. I need someone to see me. Yeah, but sorry. You don't have that choice. And on the contrary, if you walk out in public and you realize that you're not wearing matching socks or something, and you don't want anyone to see you, too bad. They're going to see you. Like a child covers his eyes because he doesn't want to be seen. Well, too bad. Which means when I come out in public, I lose control over my own existence. I can't choose one person should see me, the other person should not. Or no one should see me walking down the street. I don't have that control over my own visibility. And when I'm away from people, I can't will them to see me because I'm away. When we say that we can't see God because He's a spirit or because He's in heaven or because our eyes are deficient, that can't apply to God, because then we would be saying about God that He has the same limit we have. If He is present, then we're going to see Him. And if He doesn't want us to see Him, He has to make Himself unavailable or absent. Well, that can't be. Besides the fact that God can't be absent because He has no place to go. Where's He going to hide? Behind what wall? So to say that God leaves a place of unholiness because He doesn't want to be there, that's human. So God is very much present, in the same space in which we exist, which means that he should be visible. But if he chooses not to be, then he is not visible, even though he's present. Whereas a human being, once you make yourself present, you lose control over your visibility. It's an interesting thought, by the way, that when we come out in public, in other words, when we enter the domain of another human being, we lose control. The other person can now choose whether they want to see me or not. I'm at their mercy now. I'm living by their rules. And that's not because they impose themselves on me and force me to be visible. No, this is how I exist. This is how I was created. I am a private person. I'm an individual only up to a point. So I am a composite being. I am composed of private, my own, and then I'm partly a creature of the world, and therefore the world determines when it's going to see me and when it won't. If I'm in their space, they see me. If I'm not in their space, I can't wish them to see me. That's called a composite being. One of the 13 principles of faith is that we believe that God is a simple being. Simple meaning not composed of parts, not a composite being. He is himself thoroughly. He's not made up of other things as well. And that's why he has complete control over his visibility, whereas we don't. But this thought that I exist only partly as myself, and then there's also a part of me that exists as part of you. And that's why if I'm in your space, you can see me, even when I don't want you to. See, this explains the interconnectedness and the responsibility that we have for each other. It's not just a virtue. It's not just a noble thing. It's the reality of our existence. I exist partly as myself and partly as you. Hopefully more myself than you. Otherwise, psychiatrists have a name for that. What is it called? Transference or something? You become more me than I am? That's not so good. But if I'm only me, what does the Mishnah say? Hillel said, if I am for myself, what am I? That's not a moral thought. That's a natural thought. If I am myself, then I'm not. A human being is not a self-contained being. By nature, not by choice. And that's why it makes sense that I should be responsible for another person. And when a teenager says, well, why can't I? Just because somebody else is going to... I just want to do my thing. Why do I have to care what other people think? Why do I have to care how it affects other people? I'm just living my life. Well, my life is only partly mine. And that's why there's all sorts of laws in the Code of Jewish Law that you're not allowed to do something perfectly permissible and perfectly kosher, yet you're not allowed to do it because of the watching eye. What will it look like to people watching? And if it looks like you're sinning, you're not allowed to do it. And so I can't walk into a non-kosher restaurant to make a phone call. Because if I walk into the non-kosher restaurant, somebody watching from across the street doesn't know that I'm making a phone call. They'll think it's okay to eat in this restaurant. So I can't make a phone call, no matter how important it is. I can't make that phone call because somebody else might get the wrong impression and then go eat what they're not supposed to eat. And I can imagine a teenager saying, that's not my problem. I can't make a phone call because somebody is going to be stupid enough to think. That's right. You can't make that phone call. Now, why am I responsible? Why do I have to curtail my activities? Because somebody is going to get the impression? Why can't you stop them from seeing you? You want to go into that restaurant and make the phone call? Fine. Stop the person across the street from seeing you. Oh, you can't stop them. Why? It's your life. Why can't you stop them from seeing you? Why can't you say, don't see me? You can say it, but it doesn't help. Because you exist partly in their world. And therefore you have to consider what you're doing to their world. So God chooses not to be seen. Why? The classical answer is freedom of choice. If we could see God, how could we defy him? Now, it's been suggested that, we would find a way. We're very inventive, we're very creative, and even if we saw God, we would find a way. But it wouldn't be really free choice. The people, the Jews crossed the sea split, they saw God or godliness or something, and then a couple of days later they were fetching about, where's the beef and where's the... So yeah, you can see God and still find ways of defying him. But not so easily. You certainly couldn't be without a conscience. So maybe you could defy God, but you would repent pretty quickly. Because he's right there. You got to face him. So the classical answer is God doesn't want to be seen because he wants us to have freedom of choice. Now let's understand that a little bit. What kind of an evil plan is this? God is visible. And he is available. And he is present. And you mess that up? You make yourself unseen just so that I could ruin my life? What kind of plan is this? So it's not like God would have to do something special to let me see him. I would naturally see him. He does something special to make sure I don't see him. Why? So that I can sin. Well, thank you very much. What kind of deal is this? I mean, we know freedom of choice. Oh yeah, you have to have freedom of choice. What's so good about freedom of choice? Freedom of choice means I can defy God. Who needs this? And if I defy him, I'm in big trouble. Who set up this plan anyway? What does free choice really mean? What does God mean when he says freedom of choice? Here's where we get into the marriage. On the day God came down to Mount Sinai, he asked us to marry him. And this relationship needs to be understood and analyzed and appreciated. What does God mean when he says freedom of choice? God says, thou shalt not, whatever. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not take my name in vain. Thou shalt not covet. And then said, but you have freedom of choice. But you just said not. Is God unsure? He says not, it means no. Which part of no don't we understand? No means no. Not maybe, not partially, it means no. But then you have freedom of choice. You could. What is that? If we accept it at face value, we're cheating ourselves out of a very important and uplifting relationship. God doesn't mean, I hate killers, but if you want to, you could be one. That's freedom of choice? This is what God created the world for? I hope not. In God's mind, freedom of choice means you can love me for my money, or you can love me for me. That's freedom of choice. You can love me because I'm powerful and your life depends on my goodwill, or you can love me for me. You can love me because I provide and I protect and I bless and I reward and I punish, or you can love me for me. That's freedom of choice. In other words, in our relationship, you have a choice. You can either be shallow or you can be deep. We can either have a pleasant relationship or we can have an intimate relationship. It's your choice. But sinning, God didn't create the world for people to sin. If you're going to have a choice in the nature of your relationship with Him, you have to be free to dismiss all of it, which means sinning. But that's not the purpose. That's just the lowest expression of that freedom. But the real meaning of freedom of choice is, you want to just be nice and have a nice, pleasant relationship, or do you want to become intimate? The classical, traditional greeting for the holiday of Shavuos, the day on which God gave us the Torah, the traditional greeting is, we should receive the Torah, again this year, with joy and with inwardness. Besimcha ubepnimius. There are so many things we could say about the Torah, and we pick these two. With joy and with inwardness. How about with love? How about with excitement? How about with devotion? How about with new commitment? No, joy and inwardness. Now, doesn't that tell you that we're talking about a relationship? On Rosh Hashanah, you make good resolutions for the coming year, not on Shavuos. Right? We don't say we should re-accept the Torah with good intentions. Plan to be a better observant Jew than you were before. No, that's Rosh Hashanah. But when we're receiving the Torah, it's not a question of how you're going to behave, what you're going to do. It's joy and inwardness. Let's understand what these things are. First, what is inwardness? The Hebrew word, pnimius, can mean a number of things. Number one, inwardness can mean deep. The opposite of deep is shallow. Shallow does not mean false. We're not talking about false. That's not an option. That's not on the menu. We're talking superficial, not artificial. Artificial is false. But the relationship can either be superficial or deep. Superficial is very nice. If a person is superficially a nice person, they're a nice person. They're really nice. The only problem is that if a crisis were to come along, if they were put to a severe test, their goodness might not stand up because it doesn't go that deep. But whatever is there is good and real. It's not artificial. It's not fake. It's on the surface. But on the surface, it is good. And it's really good. But it's only on the surface. Deep means past the surface. So what are we saying? That in our relationship with God this year, we should receive the Torah or enter into this covenant deeply, not superficially. Because superficial is also good. That's the other choice. That's our freedom of choice. What would be the difference between superficial and deep? Superficial would mean as long as it works for me. Deep means unconditional. There's another meaning to the word inward. Inward means personal, not impersonal. Inward means intimate, not What is the opposite of intimate? Casual? Impersonal? The relationship can be either casual or personal. It can either be impersonal or intimate. Impersonal is still good. It's a relationship. Good things will result from it. You have an impersonal relationship with God, you follow His rules. Nothing personal. Just, He's the boss, it's His football. He says no, it's no. That's good. That would be very good. But it's not intimate. It's about rules, not about Him. Intimate means you're doing it for Him. Not simply because the law exists, but because it's His law. So we can look back at the past year and say, we've been doing mitzvahs, we've been following God's commandments, we've been behaving ourselves. But when the anniversary comes around, and it is literally an anniversary, a wedding anniversary, we have to reconsider how to improve, how to get more out of the relationship by putting more into the relationship. What more can we put into the relationship? You can make it more personal. Now I'll tell you the story. I asked this girl, a Jewish girl who claimed to have become a Christian. I said, do you keep kosher? And she very patiently explained to me how she doesn't have to keep kosher because she now will get to heaven through grace. I said, I understand. Do you keep kosher? So she explained it to me again. There was a time when the law got you into heaven, but now you don't have to have the law, you get into heaven on grace. I said, I understand. Do you keep kosher? So she explained it a third time. And I finally convinced her that I really understand. I said, I'm just wondering whether you were keeping kosher just for Him. Yeah, you'll get to heaven either way. But knowing that He wrote in the Torah that unkosher food is an abomination, are you doing it just for Him? Not to get to heaven. You can get to heaven without that. But just knowing that He prefers kosher, I thought maybe you would be doing it just for Him. Because that's the difference between impersonal and intimate. It's the same law, but you can either do it because of the law or you can do it because of who is giving this law. So, for example, a very practical example in our lives, we happen to live in a country where the civil law enforces many of God's laws. There is thou shalt not kill, and then there's the police or the court system. There's thou shalt not steal, and then there's the policeman. So you cannot steal because there's a policeman, or you cannot steal because that's what God wants. The behavior will be the same, and the morality will be the same. If you don't steal, whether it's because of the policeman or because of God, either way you're moral, but you're not intimate. You're correct, but you're not personal. There's one more meaning. I mean, we can go on and on. Inward has so many layers. But there's one more or less practical meaning to the word inwardness. There was an event years ago back in Russia, and there was a Farbrengen going on, and the Rabbi was speaking, and between talks, they were singing. And of course, Hasidim are very sensitive to, none of this is rehearsed. So they watch the Rebbe to see when he wants to speak again, and then they stop singing. So they started a song, and they were singing, and then half the people thought, looks like the Rebbe wants to speak, so they stopped. And half the people continued, and the song just went flat. The Rebbe was upset. The Rebbe said, if you sing, you should sing from within. And if you were singing from within, then you wouldn't be affected by externals. A person who lives outward, external, is always watching the clock. A person who gets into what he does fully forgets what time it is, forgets that he hasn't eaten, forgets that it's past his bedtime. Not because he's holy or because he's beyond or above nature, but simply because he's immersed in what he's doing. That's called inward. Immersed, submerged in the relationship. And when you're submerged in the relationship, you don't notice little things. He said, she said. You don't notice. Not because you're so noble, but because you're preoccupied. You're immersed. You're absorbed. Absorbed in the relationship. When you're absorbed in the relationship, the details lose their significance. There's a story you might have heard already. It sounds like a silly story, but the point that it makes is very important. There was a man living in a village somewhere where nobody could read, except for the tutor. They would bring in a tutor. He was the only one who could read. And he was very pompous about it. He was very arrogant, being the only one who could read. So when they would get letters from their family, they would bring the letter to the tutor, and he would read it to them, because they can't read. One time, a man brings a letter that he got from home. He brings it to the tutor and asks him to read it. And the tutor makes a big show of putting on his glasses and clearing his throat, and he's about to perform this service that only he can do. And with great pomp and circumstance, he reads the letter. And in the letter it says that the man's father had passed away. The man hears this, he faints. When he comes to, the tutor says to him, "I was in the middle of reading. You interrupted me. And besides, what are you fainting? You can't even read. I read what it says in the letter and I didn't faint. So what business do you have fainting?" And of course his answer was, "I may not be able to read, but it's about my father. It's not about your father. So of course I'm going to faint and not you." So there are those who hear the words and who could read the words, but it's not their father. They don't faint. But when it is your father, then whether you can read or not, whether you can make out the words, whether you're the first to hear it or not the first, it's your father. It's a whole different story. That's called inward. It applies to you personally. Intimate means applies to the other party personally. Here we're saying it's your father. It applies to you personally. When a man says, "my wife," what does that mean? What does it mean, my wife? It means that nobody else is going to faint. I'm going to faint because she's my wife. My father doesn't mean I own him, I possess him. It means that if something, God forbid, happens, nobody else is going to faint. I'm going to faint because it's my father. What does it mean, my father? It's me. That's me. So, in our relationship with God, we have 613 commandments and a couple of thousand customs. What's that all about? You can call it a lifestyle. That's nice. Not very personal. Not very deep. Not very intimate. Or you can say, this is the Torah that my God gave. Well, that changes everything. Now it's an intimate issue. Now it's my issue. It's my God. So everybody else might ignore these commandments. I can't. He's my God. Why doesn't God let us see him? To give us freedom of choice. But not the freedom to kill and to murder and to cause mayhem. God gives us freedom of choice by not being visible. And that means get past the surface. Don't love me for what you see. And yet God gathered us at Mount Sinai and said, I'm going to talk to you one-on-one and you're going to hear me. It's not going to be through a messenger. It won't be through Moshe. It will be directly from me to you so that you will have no doubts. So on the one hand, God is saying, I'm going to make myself felt. On the other hand, God says, but remember, you saw nothing. This is such a powerful concept in marriage. This speaks to the whole notion of modesty in marriage. We don't have to get into the details. We'll leave a little to the imagination. In a marriage, we should be present completely. We should be available completely. The relationship should be intimate, it should be deep, it should be personal, but not visible. When a husband and wife are intimate, the lights are off. Not seeing is as important as any other part of the relationship. Because by not seeing, by not being visible, you are given freedom of choice. You can get past the surface. And so God chooses not to be seen, at least for 6,000, minus a few years, for 6,000 years he doesn't want to be seen. After that, he will become visible. He will allow us to see him. But by then, we will have gone past the surface. So here's the story about the relationship with God and how it reflects on our relationship. God wants to be our God, not our protector, not our provider, not our holiness, not our divine image. He wants to be our God, whatever that is. And whatever that is has no limit. But how do we get to that if God allows us to see him? It wouldn't leave much room for freedom of choice. And so God says, I am what I am. Choose that. It's so much easier to say, he is the judge. He is the king. He is the creator. He is the master. All of that is true. But that's not freedom of choice. Freedom of choice means I can see all of that, I can hear all of that, but I want more. I want him. I want him to be my God, not my protector, not my big brother. In order to get there, we first have to be happy. You cannot get past the surface when you're not happy. Because the surface resists. Surface tension. You can't get past the surface when you're not happy. You skim. When you're sad, you have just enough energy to float. You have just enough energy to skim the surface, to let the current carry you. To get beneath the current, to get past the surface, you have to be happy. And that's why the traditional greeting or blessing for Shavuos is, we should receive the Torah with joy and with inwardness. The objective is inwardness. The method is joy. To get there, you have to be happy. Where are we trying to get? What are we trying to approach? What are we trying to reach? We're trying to get to the point where God is my God. And therefore I'm absorbed. I'm involved. I can't notice the petty things, the little things. He's my God. He is sometimes mysterious and strange. That's my God. Now, if we apply all this to our marriages, there couldn't be a bad marriage. So the first rule, if you're going to connect to somebody, really connect to somebody, the first rule is happy. Got to be happy. If you're not happy, you're not going anywhere. And here's where we get caught. We get trapped in this catch-22. If I loved him and he loved me, I would be happy. So first he has to love me, then I'll be happy. Well, but if you're so sad, why should he love you? You're not really appealing when you're sour. So no, first I should be happy, then the love will come. So how does it begin? It begins with the joy, because that you can do yourself. You can't have a good relationship by yourself. But joy, you can do that anytime you want. And what is the joy? I mean, you can't be happy being alone, and that's going to make for a better relationship. Obviously, the joy has to be you are happy that there is a relationship. You are happy that there can be a relationship. You're happy that you have that freedom of choice. God didn't just give us rules and leave. He made himself intimately available. For that alone, we have to be happy. Now go for it. But if you're not happy over the possibility, then why would you go for it? How would you go for it? On the surface, just barely, casually, indifferently? It's not going to work. So if you have the joy, the fact that God came down to Mount Sinai, that's it. That's our joy. What did he say? Well, that comes later. We'll find out in a minute what he said. But the fact that he came down, and that's why on Pesach, in that list of Dayenus, we say, if God had brought us to Mount Sinai and not given us the Torah, it would be sufficient. We would have to thank him for that. Thank him for what? For a tour of Mount Sinai? There's nothing special about it. It's not the biggest mountain. It's not. What would we be thankful for? Took us to Mount Sinai and never showed up. We would thank him for that? No. If he took us to Mount Sinai means he met us at Mount Sinai, but didn't give us the Torah. For that alone we should be happy. He came down to Mount Sinai, which means he made himself available. Now, in this availability, how do we go about it? That's the next step. That's the Torah. But even before he gives us the Torah, the fact that he is making himself available, or will soon make himself available, that alone is the reason for our joy. Somebody wants to marry you. Somebody agreed to marry you. Somebody married you. If that doesn't cause joy, then where is this relationship going? Yeah, but he said, she did. Wait. We haven't gotten there yet. The fact that there is a possibility of an intimate relationship, is that reason for joy? If it's not, then the story ends there. The sages ask this question: why is there no blessing made over a marriage? Before we perform any mitzvah, there's a blessing. Blessed are you, God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandment and commanded us to whatever the commandment is going to be. So before we light Shabbos candles, there's a blessing. Before we put on tefillin, blessing. Go to the mikveh, blessing. Blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, blessing. Getting married, there's no blessing. How come?
Because when you do a mitzvah, you do it, you don't take it back, but when you get married, you can always get divorced.
Well, you see, then you should make a blessing for the marriage, and then when you get divorced, make a blessing for the divorce, because that's also a mitzvah.
So the Sheva Bracha is
the Rabbi blessing us, but it's not us blessing each other.
No, the Sheva Brachot are about God creating man and blessing them in the Garden of Eden, but it's not about the mitzvah. It's not Asher Kedushanu. Now, one of the answers, I think you're getting close, one of the answers is you cannot make a blessing over a mitzvah that you can't do yourself. Because what if the other person changes his mind? And that's why you don't make a bracha when you give charity. Because when are you going to make the bracha? After you've given it? Well, then it's too late. You have to make the bracha when you're about to do it. Well, what if you make the bracha and hand them the money and he says, no thanks? Well, then you've taken God's name in vain. So in a marriage, not that they might get divorced, but in the last minute, she might say, nah, change my mind. I don't like the way you make brachas. Till I heard you make a bracha, it was fine. But now I hear you make a bracha, don't want to marry you. But that's the technical reason. So imagine if a person says, look, let's get married because, it's a big mitzvah. That's not marriage. That's not marriage. Marriage means they should become one, not do a mitzvah together. So the joy of the wedding is not the fact that they're fulfilling a mitzvah. Yeah, there are so many mitzvahs going on, but there's something that envelops the whole thing. It's something that all of it is submerged in this greater fact. The fact that God made it possible for someone to marry me. Not to do the mitzvah. To actually become one. To have a true bonding, intimate relationship. And over that fact alone, we should be very happy.
So God and us is one?
Which is why no matter how bad we are, He doesn't abandon us. He doesn't quit.
No divorce.
No divorce. We fight a lot. We scream a lot, but no divorce. I mean, in Tehillim and Psalms and in the Navi, over and over again, God says, I will get angry at you, I will punish you, I will destroy you, but I'm not going to abandon you. And why? Not because you're so good, not because you're so smart, not because you're the best, but because you're mine. So we reciprocate. We serve God and we follow His commandments and we worship Him, not because He's the best God. How do we know? There's no one to compare Him to. Not because He does so much good, not because He's been so good to me, but because He's mine. He's my God. That's called inwardly.
What's the Hebrew word for that?
Pnimius. Pnimi. Comes from the word panim, face to face. Because to see what's going on inside a person, you have to look at their face. From their back, you can't tell much. So what do you think? That's what you...
So if, because I think that a lot of people would say that they do want to be intimate with God, it's that the clarity of what God wants. I mean, that's where I think where things get a little bit more confusing is, does God like this or that? Or, down to the very minute details.
Okay,
Could God
but
have been clear? Or
could he make himself a little more clear?
well, mean, that,
But one thing we've settled, the person who says, I would love to have an intimate relationship with God, I would love to get really involved in this thing, but I can't see Him. How can you worship something you can't see? That should be laid to rest. The reason you can be intimate with God is because you don't see Him. That make sense?
it doesn't answer my question.
No, but at least we've settled that.
Yes.
Okay. Now, having gotten past the visual into the personal, into the intimate, how much do we know of God? What do we know about Him? God initiated this relationship. It was His idea to have an intimate relationship. And that's why He came down to Mount Sinai. He didn't wait for us to come climbing mountains. Which means He came to make Himself known. That's His purpose. That's His part of the relationship. He does it to perfection, like anything else. God makes Himself known so that you have no doubts and leaves no room for doubts as to what pleases Him and what doesn't. And even in those things that God didn't mention at Mount Sinai, God said, I will not leave you floundering, trying to figure me out. I will send you prophets, I will send you sages, I will send you rabbis, and if you want to know what I'm thinking or what I ask, and then it's His responsibility, it's His desire to make sure that you get the right answer, so that you know what He wants from you, what He needs from you. So a person who says, I'm not sure what God wants, then find out. There's no reason to be unsure. Find out.